अच्छा जी, लेट अस स्टार्ट जी। मुझे बताओ, डू यू रिकग्नाइज दिस ग्राफ? मुझे ये नहीं बनाना था एक्चुअली। डू यू रिकग्नाइज दिस ग्राफ? I drew it, but मुझे बताओ what is this downward sloping curve called? Demand, supply. Okay. So all of you recognize this is demand, this is supply. What do we have on the axis? यहाँ पे y axis पे क्या है हमारे पास? We have the price, and on the x-axis quantity. Now the reason I have drawn this diagram today is that I want you to remind yourselves that this is micro diagram where we are talking about the market of some individual product. Walaikum Assalam. So let's just call that product A. But what I want to stress here is a realization that here we use this model to analyze one product's market. Now, why is that important? Because today we are going to look at a diagram which is very, very similar, but this model is going to tell us very different things. And the difference in this model will be that here, instead of the demand curve, demand की जगह supply हो जाएगी, no? We will have aggregate demand. I will have to, I think, try to do this again. Yeah, this doesn't seem to be working today. Hopefully it works now. So you have aggregate demand instead of demand, and then you have aggregate supply. And here we have price level. किसमें? What is this doing here? Voltage जो है उसकी वजह से होता है। जो आपने लगाया हुआ है उसकी वजह से। बट उसने तो ठीक किया रहा था। सिर्फ उसने कि इस जो कमरे का है इसका मतलब पीछे वाले का वैसे भी लाइट दी हुई है तो लाइट कुछ ना यार क्या बकवास है इस तरह से। कब तक लाइट जाती है कुछ पता है? I put this off and it works. I don't want to miss today's class यार, बोर्ड पे उस तरह से होगी नहीं मेरे से। It's again doing the same thing. चलो, we will still get along. We will try. Now इसमें मैंने जो तुम्हें बताने की important thing is कि ये जो similarity है between these two models, it is very good. We will use that similarity to our advantage. But you also first and foremost need to understand how they are different. What does that model tell you? What does this model tell you? Now, as far as this aggregate demand supply is concerned, we will break it down in a lot of detail. We'll break it down into each individual part. What is aggregate demand curve? Why is it downward sloping? What is aggregate supply? Why is it upward sloping? Short run, long run? Because this, as I have been saying, we will use this model to run our entire macroeconomy. But before we go into those details, and remember when we break down this model, so step by step, all the details, these are things which are separately asked directly in your A-level exam. For instance, why is this aggregate demand curve downward sloping? It's a straightforward 8-mark question. Okay? So those basics are so important for understanding, as well as we go along, I'll share the MCQs essays with you. So unse separate parts pe jo bhi hai, we'll pick that up. Now, abhi humne kya karna hai? First of all, we're not going to go into any details. We are just going to try and learn like that first micro model that is telling you what is going on in the market of one individual product. What this model tells and how is it different, that is the only task of today's class. We are not going to start ADS. We are just going to learn, okay, what does it show? Okay. और उसके लिए you have to go back to your circular flow. And since this is not working, let me draw a circular flow over here and then I'll put it back on, और वहाँ से I will explain it to you. Let me just quickly draw a circular flow. Just give me 1 minute. Okay, so this is your basic circular flow, two-sector economy. You just have the households and you have the firms. Usme, this time, what we are going to do is we are going to think in terms of real flows. So remember we said there are real flows and then there are nominal flows. So if you think in terms of real flow, again, the purpose of today is not circular flow model, just the basic concept. We said households, they own all the resources, and these resources, they take to the factor market. So these resources move in clockwise direction. From factor markets, these resources will go to firms, still moving in clockwise direction. So this is where we are saying the lower circle. The lower circle is where resources move from households in the clockwise direction to the firms. And then firms convert these resources into goods. And these goods are then primarily, remember we said, bought by the households. But some of these goods, some of the total output of the country, remember we said, is also bought by the firms. Now, the complicated things that we looked at last time were the nominal flows. So if they are receiving these goods and they will have to pay money, then money will flow back, which is all still true. But here we are just keeping it simple. Real flows में बात कर रहे हैं. Now, real versus nominal, don't worry too much about it, because soon we will learn how we can convert nominal into real, real into nominal, which will tell us that it is equivalent. Either talk about flow of goods or the flow of money. That is all equal. But here we need a simple analysis. This is all we need from circular flow. Now, इसमें, sorry Amna beta, इसमें the thing that you need to now start understanding as far as ADS model is concerned. जी Amna. Amna, sorry, I forgot beta. आप कर लो join. As far as ADS is concerned, it's a really simplistic way of looking at this model. What it says is that, look, this total output that the firms decide to produce, they call that total output the aggregate supply of that economy. Okay, nothing complicated here. We are actually simplifying things. Firms, they produce the total output. We call it the country's aggregate supply. Yani the total amount of output that firms are deciding to produce in a country. On the other hand, once these goods reach the goods market, so we have just a single sector economy. In this, I should say two-sector economy, there are just these two sectors that are doing all the purchasing, keh lo bhi, an easy word. So most of this country's output is being bought by the households. Some of it is bought by the firms. We know the names that we use to denote each one of these. Yeah, I'm getting so irritated by this now. Marker है हमारी class में. I'll do it on the board actually. Anybody has a marker here? Leo. Just breaking the flow. क्या 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 फिर बताओ. अच्छा, this HDMI is interfering with the pen. सर जो आपकी केबल का वोल्टेज है उसकी वजह से जो पेन के अंदर लगा हुआ है उससे डायरेक्ट आपकी जो उसमें नहीं आ रहा. बट उस क्लास में क्यों चल रहा था? क्योंकि इसका वायर पुरानी वायर है, बेसिकली सिग्नल मिस कर रही है आई थिंक. इसका हल निकालना, मसला बता दिया मुझे, इसका हल निकालो ना। अच्छा चलो चलो चलो, लेट अस ट्राई टू गेट द मोस्ट आउट ऑफ इट। मुझे इरिटेशन ये होती है, आई प्लान टू गेट दिस होल थिंग इनटू अ पर्टिकुलर डायरेक्शन फ्रॉम वेयर वी कैन मेक इट ये सारा बीच में। अच्छा अभी तक मुझे बताओ, यू गाइस आर विद मी, अभी मैंने कुछ स्पेशल चीजें तुम्हें बताई, आई एम जस्ट इंट्रोड्यूसिंग द टर्मिनोलॉजी, और उसमें आप कह रहे हैं कि द टोटल आउटपुट दैट द फर्म इज प्रोड्यूसिंग इज नोन एज एग्रीगेट सप्लाई। या क्लास में प्लीज बात ना किया करो, मेरी रिक्वेस्ट समझ लो या जो भी समझ लो, अगली दफा रिक्वेस्ट मैं करूंगा, बाहर उठ के चले जाए तो व्हेनेवर यू क्लास में बात नहीं, मेरे मुंह से किसी को कुछ सुनोगे, आई कांट कंट्रोल माय सेल्फ। मैंने टॉकिंग एंड यू डू दिस, मेरे मुंह से गलत बात निकलवाओगे और उसके बाद रोना डाल दोगे। Okay, the other part of the terminology of ADAS is okay, the total output that these two sectors are buying, the C coming or going to the households, and I, which we say is the amount bought by firms. In dono ko, in this model of aggregate demand and supply, we call the aggregate demand of the total output that is being bought. There are just two sectors. There is nothing else. That is why I stress that we are building an imaginary hypothetical world. So if you consider a two-sector economy, then these are the only two players who would buy the country's output. And we are saying the sum of what households are buying plus what firms are buying is the total demand for the country's total output. We give it the name of aggregate demand. ठीक है, that simple है. Alright. Now, यहाँ पे we can add the other two sectors. Just let us complete this thing. So we can just bring in the other two sectors, the government, and what is the other sector? External sector. And the only thing that we need to add because of these two sectors is that the sum of the country's total output will also be demanded by the government, and some of it will also be demanded by the external sector. Now, whatever your government demands, that is known as G. Whatever your external sector demands, that is known as E, exports. Now, at this point, let me explain net exports all apart. I keep on telling you it's always net exports, but why is that the case? Ask me if what I'm going to tell you is not clear. It's a minor thing. Again, all of these are some minor things. I don't want you to get bogged down. So, ek dafa, once and for all, remember this thing. Dekho, our purpose, our intention, our focus, our target here in all of this discussion is the total demand or the total spending on the output of Pakistan's domestic economy. If you are considering the service of one member economy of Pakistan. If Pakistan के goods पे कितना खर्चा हो रहा है, Pakistan में कितनी output आ रही है. We are saying some of it is bought by households, that is known as consumption. Now let's assume you earn 1,000 rupees or 100,000 rupees every month and you spend all of it. Do you think all of this spending of the consumers is on local homemade goods? It is not. कहाँ पे फिर पैसा लगता है local goods के अलावा? Imports पे. So let's assume that your households, which together are spending or consuming 100, उसमें से let's say 80 is on domestic products, but 20 is on imports. Now यहाँ पे our purpose again, उसमें भी मेरे से किसी ने question पूछा था, export import को balance करना है आपस में. It's not about balancing export import. वो import is a leakage, वो निकल गई system में से. We are not talking about leakages here. वहाँ पे external sector की जो demand है उसको export की बजाय net export यानी export minus import. The reason for that is you are looking what all the four sectors together are spending on the output of this domestic economy's market. When you calculate consumption in reality, where do you get the data from? Logon ki income tax returns. So the government looks at my income tax return and it says this person is spending 1,000 rupees, another person is spending 2,000 rupees. So they collectively add all the spendings through the income tax returns. And they come up with it's a total consumption of all the households का number. Now then governments realize कि लोग इन सारी consumptions को हमने add तो कर लिया, but some of it is not on our domestic output. Some of these households consumptions which we have added इनकम टैक्स रिटर्न में देखोगे तो इनकम टैक्स में तो सिर्फ ये होगा कि आई बॉट अ कार whose price was इतनी, तो इस पे टैक्स लगाओ। उन चक्रों में that price of car is included in household consumption. Later government realizes कुछ imports पे consumption लगी हुई है भाई, we should take it out of consumption so that they will get a true reflection of the demand for our own country's output, which is the GDP of this country. Now, convention is that instead of saying consumption minus imports, consumption को तुम नहीं छेड़ते, you let it be, and when you get here, exports क्यों पार्ट होंगी इस एग्रीगेट डिमांड का? दैट इज वेरी इजी। सम फॉरेन कंट्री व्हेन इट डिमांड्स आउटपुट ऑफ योर इकोनॉमी, तो हम उसको एक्सपोर्ट के तौर पे ऐड कर देंगे, इट्स एन एडिशनल सोर्स ऑफ डिमांड फॉर माय कंट्रीज प्रोडक्ट्स। बट जो इंपोर्ट्स यहाँ पे निकालने चाहिए थे, बाय कन्वेंशन वी डू इट एट द एंड, एक्सपोर्ट माइनस इंपोर्ट। समझ आइए इस चीज में? ओके, सो उसके बाद हमारा फिर रट्टा क्या है? द थिंग दैट विल बी ऑन योर टंग, aggregate demand, CIGNX. Remember NX, export minus import की छोटी सी technical वजह, nothing complicated. और उसके बाद also remember that this net export, which is export minus import, this is known as your trade balance of the country. We will study trade balance बाद में कहीं जाके, but अभी से ये चीजें याद रखो. This is what will allow you to find those conflicts. You already have aggregate demand for domestic output. अच्छा जी, so यहाँ तक clear है? This whole part is the aggregate demand in this ADAS model. This is the aggregate supply. If you have want to be fancy, so this is your demand side of the economy. बड़े-बड़े economists, बड़े-बड़े फॉर्म में सुनोगे demand side का issue है. What does that mean? It simply means this diagram को ज़हन में लेके, और demand side means this total aggregate demand coming for the economy. There can be a problem in the sense household डर जाते हैं, they are unsure about the future, so they start consuming. तो आपको अगर demand side shock लग गया economy को, consumers are not spending, suddenly aggregate demand ही मुझमें से खत्म हो गई. So coronavirus was one such thing. Everybody is afraid, everybody is uncertain, नौकरी है नहीं है, so everybody is starting to postpone their purchases of everything. So आप कहते थे economic economy में से households have stopped consuming, they are afraid, firms have stopped investing, they are unsure about the future, demand side shock लग गया economy को. Okay? So we will soon by the end of this class be able to analyze कि अच्छा उसे पूरी economy में क्या होगा. But first of all, I'm just trying to get your basics. Demand side of the economy, supply side of the economy, nothing complicated. Now the next part, ये भी नहीं चला यार, I wish it was working today. The next part of this model, again don't complicate it. मैं तुम्हें कह रहा हूँ circular flow is just there to tell us where is this ADAS thing coming from. Now इस model में we say that the in equilibrium, the country's aggregate demand will be equal to country's aggregate supply. Which is again a very simple idea. Total output will be produced in the economy. If what the firms have decided to produce is exactly equal to what all the four sectors together want to buy, AD is equal to AS, तो हम कहते हैं this economy is equilibrium. अभी तक कोई question किसी को? I hope so far it's pretty simple. Now, उसके बाद the idea is equilibrium can change. It won't always stay the same. AD is equal to AS. Whatever is produced and supplied is the amount of total output that these four sectors want to buy. This equilibrium can change. Why? Because this aggregate demand, CIGNX, for instance, it can change. It doesn't have to be the same. You start this year, yes, maybe 100 cars are being produced and demanded. It's an equilibrium. But consumption, as I said, households corona hai, they're afraid, they're uncertain about the future, they are uncertain about kal ko naukri hai ki nahi hai. They stop consuming. Firms start investing more. दो बार धमाके होते हैं, they are afraid, they pull back on investments. So aggregate demand can always change, and that would change the whole equilibrium. Aggregate supply can also change, that will also change the whole equilibrium. So in this model of ADAS, let's stick to aggregate demand side first of all. When we say equilibrium can change, then we start thinking about, okay, what can cause aggregate demand to change? So we are almost there to our aggregate demand supply model. We have not said anything complicated. Simple सी बात है, total output aggregate supply, the total amount that four sectors want to buy aggregate demand. Usually AD is equal to AS in equilibrium, but we are saying equilibrium can change because countries' aggregate demand can change because of a change in either of these four components. So macroeconomists start thinking about what can cause aggregate demand to change. And this is where this model becomes really, very similar to, and this is why I wanted that thing to be working, so that we could have everything in one place. But hopefully you can see it. If it's too small, you can let me know. This whole ADES thing I showed on the right, it becomes very, very similar with what we have been doing. Kyun? Because when you were looking at this usual demand supply model of micro, you had the market of one single product, let's say such as apples, and your issue there was that on the one hand you have consumers who are deciding how much to buy of this single product. And we said that there are many things that will influence the decision of these consumers, how much they want to buy. So micro mainly said consumers of a single product, when they are deciding how many apples to buy, then there are many things that will influence these consumers. But what is the most important one? कौन बोला है? और किसी को नहीं याद है? After 1 year of micro, the reason to take price on the y-axis, saying we are thinking about how much consumers want to buy of this product. Out of the many things that will influence these consumers, we said most important is price. So let's figure out how is price and what or how much consumers wish to buy, how is that related? We said that is negatively related, and that gave us the demand curve of one single individual product. उल्लू बाटों की तरह मुझे जितने लोग भी अभी देख रहे हैं, मुझे तुम्हारे पे तरस की बजाय गुस्सा आ रहा है. If you can't make sense of it beyond me, I mean, this is something you need to understand right now. I am not going to stop and explain this here. This is your micro single market analysis. Now, why I'm saying aggregate demand and supply is very similar. Aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply, but aggregate demand can change. What these four sectors that together constitute the entire economy and therefore the entire aggregate demand of the country, this can change. And we are thinking, okay, किस वजह से change हो सकती है? And again we reach the same conclusion. Out of the many different things that can affect the aggregate demand of the entire country, out of many different things that can affect either consumption, investment, GNME, we assume that the most important one is the price level. Since it's macro, we are not talking about one individual product, we are not talking about the price of one individual product, we are not talking about quantity of any one single product. We are talking about total demand for the country's entire economy coming from all the four sectors. What will that depend on? I'm getting on the price level, which remember I introduced in the first class. It's a macro variable. Average price level is an estimated average price of all the goods. और उसकी basis पे we get a very similar diagram, but on the y-axis we have price level, not price, and this changes everything. वहाँ एक product की बात कर रहे हो, यहाँ you are talking about average price in your entire country considering all the different products. On the x-axis, you are not going to measure how many apples or how many oranges or how much of one individual product. You are going to measure the demand for the total output, which we learned in the last video is known as GDP of the country. And then, it's simple. You get a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Conceptually the same thing, but these two diagrams are totally different. Here when you pick up a certain price or point along the y-axis, that is telling you the price of one apple, and if that is the price of one apple, this horizontal distance here on the x-axis, that tells you the quantity that the consumers of apples will want to buy. Concept here is exactly the same, but when you pick up a point on this y-axis, you are picking up a certain level of prices in the economy, and at that price level, this horizontal distance is telling you the total aggregate demand, that is the demand coming from all the four sectors taken together. Is price level पे कितनी होगी? So if this is PL1, let's call this AD1. यहाँ पे when you move down along this demand curve, it was telling you कि when prices fall, then more apples will be bought. उसका reason क्या था? One simple reason is substitution effect. If apples are cheaper, relatively speaking, बाकी फल महंगे हो जाते हैं. So you substitute, you maybe stop eating mangoes which are more expensive and you move towards apples. So एक चीज महंगी हुई है या सस्ती हुई है, that is what is stealing this micro or causing this micro movement. वहाँ पे when price level falls and you move to this new point on your aggregate demand curve, then this is telling you conceptually the same thing, but it's reflecting something totally different. Economy में कीमतें कम हो गई हैं और उसकी वजह से all the four sectors together now are demanding more output from the entire country. So यहाँ हमने GDP लिखा है. Remember, we are not saying it's equilibrium GDP. We are saying it is the GDP. This curve is showing what they would want to buy. We don't know if that will be produced or not. But given these price levels, this curve shows what the demand side wants to do. Clear है ये difference? Okay. This will be a lot of help going forward, because as you can already start predicting, conceptual framework of how to analyze the changes and equilibrium, it's exactly the same. Just understand, ये बिल्कुल फर्क दुनिया है, वो बिल्कुल फर्क दुनिया है, and that is the mistake you do. You don't understand फर्क क्या है, and therefore you start mixing things up. So पहले ये aggregate demand आ गई. Any question on this? किसी को कोई question हो तो मैं इसे clear कर लो. You're still again running out of time. आज मेरी गलती नहीं, I just think mistake. Cause this kind of thing. But let me take a little bit of speed. मुझे आखिर में पहुंचने दो. If you have question, you can solve. Now, aggregate demand curve यहाँ पे ये आ गई, and then the analysis of the supply side. इस supply side का word मैं जान पूछ यूज कर रहा हूँ. Supply side, demand side. Next time I use this word, you close your eyes and start building this image in your mind. इस साइड पे डिमांड साइड CCID है, नेक्स्ट इस साइड पे एग्रीगेट सप्लाई साइड है, बीच में इकोनॉमी की टोटल आउटपुट है. स्टार्ट थिंकिंग अबाउट मैक्रो लाइक दिस. स्टार्ट लिमिटिंग योरसेल्फ कि ये डिमांड साइड सप्लाई साइड जस्ट फोर प्लेयर्स, दैट्स ऑल. एंड स्टार्ट टेलिंग एंड कन्विंसिंग योरसेल्फ कि यही मैक्रो इकोनॉमी है. डोंट ट्राई टू लुक फॉर कि नहीं अभी कुछ रॉकेट साइंस बताएंगे, मैक्रो इकोनॉमी पार्ट है, यही रॉकेट साइंस है. यहां से लेट अस मेक एन एग्रीगेट सप्लाई कर्व. Aggregate supply, again we will look at a lot of detail. Here I just want to contrast it. कि micro में you were looking at the price of the product and how much the producers of that single product would want to sell. यहाँ पे you are looking at the price level of the economy and how much total output the firms would wish to bring and produce. Totally, entirely in the whole country. And उसमें the idea same. कीमतें अगर बहुत कम है, most of the producers will be discouraged. They don't want to or won't want to produce a lot. But if price levels increase, then producers jump in and they want to produce more. They want to earn more profits. So you get an upward sloping aggregate supply. Next comes equilibrium. इधर तुमने focus करना है, मैंने go to the equilibrium there. In micro, equilibrium told you that out of the many different quantities of apples that producers may wish to produce and consumers may wish to buy, this Q star used to tell you, like, look, this is the quantity that both the producers will produce, the consumers will buy, and this is therefore the quantity that will exist in the market. यहाँ पे the concept as to how you identify equilibrium is exactly the same. But again, just understand कि when you think about the equilibrium on the x-axis here, you are thinking about equilibrium GDP. That is out of all the many different total outputs that the supply side may wish to produce or the demand side may wish to buy in the macroeconomy. आप कहते हो this GDP star is the one where this economy will settle into an equilibrium. This will be the total output that will actually exist because this is where the economy will settle. कि इतना ही खरीदा जा रहा है, इतना ही बेचा जा रहा है. Exactly the same conceptual framework. और आज किधर मूव था? This is what I want you to remember. ADS को to really make it useful too. Conflict से घबराते हो तुम सारे. You can start seeing those conflicts already. Conflicts में तुम्हें बताता हूँ, but the reason is GDP, total output. Remember your concept. If I tell you on this graph, this is the certain amount of GDP and I shift then I tell you देखो GDP बढ़ गई. If GDP increases, what will happen to employment? How will you explain that? Why would employment increase? ज़्यादा output बनानी है तो आपको ज़्यादा बनने चाहिए. Remember that link. Because in exams, whenever you draw this ADS to arrive at anything, तो अपने analysis को GDP पे ना रोक दो. Add these lines that look, since GDP, let's say आपको पता चलता है you shift curve, it's increasing. This GDP in turn determines the total employment of the economy and therefore total unemployment. Last video and all of that circular flow, last class में वो हम circle, what did we learn? That in equilibrium, GDP or its value, it is equal to this total spending that will be done and it is equal to the country's national income. So you also know what is the country's national income. Then you also know what is the country's price level. You already know more than half of the indicators that I introduced last time. If you know your ADS, you can tell what some economic change would do to this ADS diagram, shift it, use the same conceptual framework to figure out the new equilibrium. You already will start seeing conflicts. 3 indicators x-axis में, 1 indicator y-axis पे. You try to correct either one of this, price level will misbehave. You control price levels, x-axis के variables जो बढ़ने चाहिए, GDP, employment, income, they will start slowing down. Already there is conflicts. Okay. अभी this is how I want to sum up. मैंने तुम्हें एक example देनी है, but all of this discussion, this is how I want you to remember this thing. This macro version of this graph, which please don't forget the x's. They are so important. A-level examiner MCQ में भी test करेगा. Just the fact, do you know the importance and do you have a memory of what these x's mean? He will catch you in MCQs on this thing. He will ask this in essay questions. Why? Because everybody knows this is the mistake to do. And this is the difference you have to understand to start understanding micro versus macro. So the way I want you to sum this up in your mind is, this macro version is a much bigger thing. It's a much serious thing. Here, this is telling you about one particular product's market and what is happening to the price quantity of that one particular product. And here, this graph is telling you much more. It is telling you about the total output of the entire country, the total employment therefore of the entire country, the total income of the entire country, the price level of the entire country. And the reason, जो मैं तुम्हें पिछले 2 दिन से तुम्हें कह रहा हूँ कि क्लासें ना मिस करो और शुरू कीजिए समझो. The thing that I really want you to understand is, instead of memorizing ना कि अच्छा ये वाला ये बता देते, ये वाला ये बता देते. This is what you have to tell yourselves. This reflects what goes on in the market of one product. This ADS wala version reflects first of all your circular flow, and your circular flow in turn is an easy theoretical way of thinking and reflecting the whole macroeconomy. So this ADS, by reflecting your circular flow, it reflects what goes on in your entire economy. And that is why this is often known as a graph or a model that is considered to be a snapshot of your entire macroeconomy at any given time. तुम्हें सब कुछ इसमें नजर आ जाता है. And what is more important is that इसकी जो shift है ADAS, of course they have their own reasons. But as I said, the analysis, AD increases, what will happen? Use the same framework. Shift the graph. You know, वही micro वाला सारा हिसाब. Let me do one over here. Actually, I'll do with another example. अभी तक तो question is that clear कि ये graph कैसे फर्क है? Now we will break it down. AD अलग से, AS अलग से. Of course, there will be some complications. We have two different versions of aggregate supply. But once you understand this basic, once you are in a position where I am talking about AD, AS, without reminding you, I would be assuming that you can every now and then close your eyes, go back, अच्छा ADS के पीछे ये demand side है, ये supply side है, बीच में there is a market, and this is the circular flow we are talking about. उसके बाद treat it like this thing, when you have to shift and figure out changes. अब let me give you an example. सिर्फ इतना सा तुम्हें फर्क पता हो. Trust me, you already know a lot of macro. Why? Because you can already start. मेरे ज़हन में वो कंट्रोल Z आ रहा था अनडू करने के लिए. Sometimes I get confused between online and this. एक मुझे एग्जांपल देने तो मैं रात को क्लास. Hopefully today in time. What do I mean when I say कि तुम्हें already macro आ जाएगी? If you just understand कि ADS के पीछे show क्या होता है. Now, all of what I tell you may not make sense, लेकिन हम सारी चीज बारी-बारी समझेंगे. But let's assume you are asked, interest rate in the country is reduced by the central bank. It's a hotly debated topic. होना चाहिए, नहीं होना चाहिए. करते हैं तो गालियाँ खाते हैं, नहीं करते तो central bank को तुम लोग फिर भी गालियाँ खाते हो. This is the problem that your country is facing. This is the problem that every macroeconomic policy maker faces. Interest rate. कभी कोई खुश नहीं होता central bank से. दोनों तरफ से गालियाँ खाते हैं. Now why? We can already work out interest rate change का economic effect क्या होगा. This is something you will get in your A2s. तुम फिर का बैठ के रटे लगाओगे. All you need to remember is just one small little thing. Interest rates, they are the cost of borrowing. I go and borrow money from the bank, I have to pay an interest. It's a cost of borrowing. So जब interest rate कम होता है ना economy में, what happens? Cost of borrowing is less. So first of all, households borrow more to consume more, and then the main impact of interest rate decline. Cost of borrowing कम है, so firms borrow more to invest more. सर ये कब होता है? इंटरेस्ट रेट जब कम होता है. तुमने कार लेनी है, तुम बैंक पे जाते हो, वो कहता है भाई 20% पे लीज दूंगा, यू कम बैक. कॉस्ट ऑफ बोरिंग बहुत ज्यादा है. कॉस्ट ऑफ बोरिंग गोज डाउन, हाउसहोल्ड स्टार्ट बोरिंग मोर, सिमिलरली फर्म स्टार्ट बोरिंग मोर फॉर इन्वेस्टमेंट. यू जस्ट नीड टू अंडरस्टैंड दिस थिंग. और ये इतनी जरूरी है कि A2 के ये 1 के आखिर तक तुम्हें रट्टा लगा होगा. O लेवल से भी you should have a memory of this thing. When interest rates go down and cost of borrowing कम होती है, consumption and investment बढ़ जाती है. Now, इसके आगे मुझे खुद नहीं रट्टा कि interest rate गिरेगा तो क्या होगा. Actually मुझे रट्टा है because it's practical thing, but you don't need to have a memory. What you need to do, अगर ये हमें करने दे, this is the last thing I want to do, and I hope today I will let you go without any emergency in time. Let's see. इतना सा जब तुम्हें पता चल जाए, तो you start off with an assumed initial macro equilibrium. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply. In the back of your mind, you tell yourself that this is reflecting my circular flow, and aggregate demand CIGNX is equal to aggregate supply. This GDP is telling us that look, this country may be able to produce billions of dollars worth of output. It may be able to produce maybe trillions of dollars worth of output. But this is an assumed starting equilibrium. That look, we have to pick up one starting point. Let's assume this is the total output that that country is producing. Now we have to analyze what will be the impact of interest rate decline. We have already worked out C or I बढ़ जाएगा. Don't need anything else because that should tell us aggregate demand will shift. Something other than price level has made consumers and the households and firms to start buying more at every price level. So आप कहते हो aggregate demand in the country at each price level is increasing. maybe they are too confident. Okay? Aggregate demand shift to the right. उसके बाद कोई rocket science नहीं लगानी. Just use your conceptual framework. जहाँ पे cross करेंगे ना curves फिर से that will be my new equilibrium. You can analyze why would you get to this new equilibrium. ये price level था, ये aggregate demand थी. This is gone. Circular flow को याद रखो. एकदम से aggregate demand ज़्यादा है. It means there are too many of these four sectors waiting outside these shops, but there is not enough. ये यही reflect करेगा. You look, aggregate demand has increased, so at the original price level, aggregate demand is much more, aggregate supply is much less. There is a shortage at the macro level in the economy. तुम कोई चीज लेने जाते हो, तुम्हें हर दुकान वाला बताता है कि आजकल कहीं से भी नहीं मिलेगी, आपको शॉर्ट हुई है पीछे से. That is the sort of shortage we are talking about. और उसके बाद थोड़े से बाद कीमतें बढ़ने लग गई. Same conceptual framework. Just remember, इस सारे के पीछे it's the circular flow, the entire economy. This shortage is of total aggregate demand versus total output. We are not talking about one single product. And because of that, we say that generally कीमतें बढ़ना शुरू हो जाएंगी मुल्क में. And that will bring you to this equilibrium where aggregate supply will respond a bit, aggregate demand वापस आएगी थोड़ी सी. I mean, you don't even need that detail. You can quickly jump to this equilibrium and you can say interest rate. Investment consumption increase, aggregate demand shifted to the right at this new equilibrium. GDP will increase. Since GDP increases, employment will increase. Since in equilibrium output is equal to employment is equal to national income, the national income will also increase, but all at the expense of increasing price level on inflation. So this is something that goes wrong. ये सारा कुछ तो ठीक हो गया interest rate lowering से. And when there is inflation, foreigners will be there buy more of Pakistani products or lesser? Less. Exports बढ़ेंगे के कम होगा. So your trade deficit, will it worsen or improve? Worsen. So that will worsen your trade deficit. ट्रेड डेफिसिट वर्सन मतलब एक्सपोर्ट नहीं कर रहे, इंपोर्ट करी जा रहे हो, पैसा मुझसे बाहर जाई जा रहा है. एक्सचेंज रेट को क्या होगा? आयोजित Again, if you don't know it at this point, fine. पूरा ऐसा टॉपिक है. Here, all I'm trying to tell you is तुम्हारा क्या निकालना. You already have all the links here. याद नहीं करने. I don't have a memory, तो तुम्हें भी नहीं लगेगी memories. Because you can start from any point. You can't memorize it. पागल हो जाओगे, गोल घूम जाओगे. Because मैं इस सारे को अभी 6 जगह और घुमा सकता हूँ कि जब फिर exchange rate कम होगा तो ये होगा, वो होगा. So we don't have to memorize the conflicts. Look at the variable, figure out AD कहाँ पे जाएगी, come back to this diagram. This will tell you that look, because of this, GDP, employment, income increases. If you are writing this in your A-level essay question, just don't write GDP will increase and therefore employment will increase. Add a line into it. More GDP means more output is being produced, which means firms will have to hire more people and buy more resources to produce that larger amount of output. So employment will increase in the economy. And then add another line, since more people are employed, therefore there are more wages that are going to be earned, there are more profits that are going to be earned, so national income will increase. यहाँ से गवर्नमेंट को भी ला सकते हो, since people have more jobs and more income, गवर्नमेंट का टैक्स रेवेन्यू बढ़ जाएगा. गवर्नमेंट का टैक्स रेवेन्यू बढ़ता है तो they would have more money to spend. बट मैं उन चीजों पे भी नहीं जाना चाह रहा. These are the important ones जो मैंने तुम्हारे सामने लिखी. More than enough answer even for your A2. The impact of interest rate through this ADAS. This will help you to get to this impact. This will fetch you extra marks. अब मैं तुम्हें कहता हूँ कोरोना आ गया. What will happen to the economy? Again, start off with an assumed aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So इधर output या GDP MCQ में जानबूझ के इंटरवल तरक्की में डालते हैं. माइक्रो में हमेशा Q होगा. There won't be anything other than Q. मैक्रो में कभी आउटपुट, कभी जीडीपी, कभी रियल जीडीपी, कभी रियल आउटपुट. जस्ट रिमेंबर सर्कुलर फ्लो वही पूरी मैक्रो की बात होगी. सो कोरोना का एनालिसिस तुम कैसे करोगे? There must have been an aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and therefore an equilibrium GDP and equilibrium price level. कोरोना आए क्या होगा? कंज्यूमर्स डर गए हैं भाई, फर्म्स डर गए हैं, दे आर नॉट कंज्यूमिंग, दे आर नॉट इन्वेस्टिंग, मुल्क में से एग्रीगेट डिमांड खत्म हो गई है, एग्रीगेट डिमांड को लेफ्ट शिफ्ट करो, हैव योर आंसर, इकोनॉमी श्रिंक हो जाएगी, जीडीपी विल fall, employment will fall, क्योंकि चीजें निकालनी तो firms will start hiring people, this is what we all saw, और उसके बाद लोगों की इनकम्स कम होंगी, हर बंदा बैठ कर दूसरे से कर्जा मांगेगा, that is again what we saw, but there are some things such as restaurant meals जहाँ पे you started to see massive discounts, all reflected through this simple graph, और ये जो मैंने तुम्हें इंटरेस्ट रेट की भी बात की है, this is the reality that this model reflects. So this is where I am saying circular flow बिल्कुल एक hypothetical imaginary world, but from there we get this very useful analytical tool, और उसके through we can work out किसी भी policy, किसी भी चीज का effect. So interest rate आपसे याद रखना, क्यों इतनी बहस होती है interest rate बढ़ना चाहिए कि नहीं बढ़ना चाहिए. I had a few news clips that I wanted to share with you. All financial newspapers all the time, European Central Bank, आजकल के अमेरिका में Federal Central Bank of America, they had a press conference वहाँ के 2:30 बजे. Whole market, whole Bitcoin market, billions of dollars is just waiting for one thing. Central Bank वाले आके interest rate के बारे में क्या hint देंगे? If they give a hint कि हम इस interest rate कम करने लगे, सबको पता है stock market ने ठा ऊपर जाना है, because people will be able to predict aggregate demand बढ़ने लगी है, interest rate कम होगा, PNG will be able to sell more, it will make more profits, का stock ऊपर जाएगा, everybody will learn and start buying stocks. और इसीलिए यही exact conflicts है which the policy makers are trying to balance. These are the exact conflicts जिनकी वजह से हम कहते हैं कि monetary policy, running the macroeconomy is not a science, it's an art where the artist, the policy maker, he has to guess. इन्फ्लेशन कंट्रोल करना सबसे जरूरी है इस वक्त, या ट्रेड डेफिसिट कंट्रोल करना जरूरी है, या कोरोना की वजह से लोगों की इतनी अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट है कि फॉरगेट अबाउट इन्फ्लेशन, जस्ट लोअर द इंटरेस्ट रेट, पंप मोर एग्रीगेट डिमांड इन द इकोनॉमी, जिससे अभी हम तरीके और ऐसा सीखते जाएंगे, सो दैट ये एग्रीगेट डिमांड उधर जाती है. फॉरगेट अबाउट इन्फ्लेशन दैट विल बी क्रिएटेड, फॉरगेट अबाउट योर ट्रेड डेफिसिट. इस वक्त हमें वी नीड एन इंक्रीज इन जीडीपी, एम्प्लॉयमेंट. एक और इकोनॉमी है, maybe that considers कि we have been growing quite a lot since the last 10 years. अब इकोनॉमी ओवरहीट हो रही है, कीमतें बढ़ रही हैं, let's slow it down. इनकम टैक्स बढ़ा देंगे, they will suck out the purchasing power of households, aggregate demand will. So, I mean, you will pick up all these things, but I hope you get the idea. अभी कोई नहीं आया. अब तुमने याद ये रखना है कि I would have wished you had this lecture. But ADAS versus demand supply का फर्क याद रखो. Tell yourself ADAS is reflecting the circular flow. Tell yourself it will tell you about everything you need to know about macroeconomy. अब our task is to first of all separately construct aggregate demand, separately construct aggregate supply. फिर उनको finally जब detail में हम समझ लेंगे तो we will bring them together, look at this equilibrium again, and from there we will do. Okay? Question also I can wait 5 minutes outside.
Method of calculating GDP. ये नेशनल इनकम आइडेंटिटी है.
हाँ.
एक ये मैं तुझे इसीलिए कह रहा था, ये मुश्किल सा टॉपिक है, शुरू में पहली सर्कुलर को, बट उसको उससे ज़्यादा नहीं करना है कि भाई इक्वालिटी और आगे भी मैं नॉर्मल
ये लो
मेरा नाम भी लिखते हो.
नाम नहीं आता
पहले मैं लिखता
मेरा पहले था वो मैंने नहीं देना अब बहुत कम करके मारिया शफाक लगा दी इब्राहिम आपकी मेरे पेन के साथ. मैंने लिखा किसने?
तो ये मैंने डाल मैं तो साथ काम करती
और फिर यार
यार आज टाइम पे बाहर सामने की सॉरी आप मैं सोचा है टाइम पे आई विल गेट आउट ये
सर एक सवाल पूछना
वो जाके ना नहीं मैं दोबारा नहीं बताऊंगा तुझे क्योंकि वो चीज़ तुझे पूरी आनी चाहिए। मैंने जो पहली क्लास थी ना जिसमें हमने यही सर्कुलर फ्लो इनकम के पर्सपेक्टिव से किया था वो वीडियो मैंने 40 मिनट की पूरी डाली, वो जाके देखो उसको उसके बाद मेरे से पूछ लो।
वो जो लाइव सेशन
वाली उसमें जो तुम कह रहे हो ना सर्कुलर फ्लो वो थोड़ा कॉम्प्लिकेटेड है, बट वो तुमने याद रखने के उसके एंड में जो एक आइडेंटिटी निकाल लेना उस हद तक उस हमें कॉम्प्लिकेटेड सर्कुलर फ्लो चाहिए। ADAS के लिए आज जो मैंने तुम्हें करवाया है पिछला पता होने के बगैर दैट इज मोर देन हाँ तुम आए जाओ, क्या हाल है तुम्हारा? अच्छा ठीक है, मेरे दिन में बिल्कुल भी मज़ा नहीं आया, मैं कोई और ही घूमता रहा। अच्छा क्या हालात हैं?
सर मैं मिसाल की मीटिंग थी